You know how when we were kids, we read all these stories about people like, oh, the children in Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe. They find this magical land of Narnia just inside the wardrobe. When we hear stories like Harry Potter, where he has this kind of miserable little life, and then he grows up or he gets a little older and he finds out that he actually is a wizard. His parents are wizards. Luke Skywalker, he finds out there's this glorious family dynasty dating back to the days of the Old Republic, etc., etc. Right? We hear these stories as kids and we fantasize that one day we'll be a Cinderella or a Luke and we'll someday have some sort of great big family reveal. And there's this whole story that you are a part of, that this line came before you and will come after you, and now you have a role. You have an identity that is given to you that you must live up to. I'd like to tell you a little story. See this painting behind me? I'm going to tell you why I'm standing in front of it in just a minute. 5 years ago, this was June 2015. My mother somewhat suddenly passed away. My brother and I, we went to visit her mom, our grandmother, and we found a trove of her family documents up in the attic. Dusting them off. Never seen them before. We looked through them, and my brother and I come to find out that we are the 9th great-grandsons of this fellow right here, depicted in this painting, the signing of the Treaty of Greenville, which made Ohio a state. This fellow, bottom left-hand corner here, was a fellow named Leatherlips. He was named as such by the settlers of this part of the country because his word was as strong as the most durable material craftsmen had at the time, which of course was leather. Also depicted in this are Chief Little Turtle, you've got Blue Jacket, you've got William Henry Harrison, Mad Anthony Wayne, you've got Lewis and Clark in here, you've got future President William Henry Harrison, you've got a kind of a bit of a rogues gallery, you might say. Now, summer 2015, we find out, okay, so who was this guy? Well, come to find out, Chief Leatherlips here had one heck of a story that made my brother and I's eyebrows just about jump off of our faces. We start researching this fellow after we find this trove of documents. Here's what's interesting. During and after the American Revolution, the U.S. Americans here were in fact at war with quite a few of the native peoples as the United States, a young country, expanded westward. There was a confederacy of Native American tribes that banded together to push back and do what they could to hold back the growing United States of America. This was a costly, bloody conflict for both sides, both the U.S. Americans and the native peoples and their families, their sons, their daughters, their wives, and their husbands. Chief Leatherlips here of the Wyandot Nation against the country to which his son-in-law and his grandchild belonged. As a result, the Wyandots and everyone else who's depicted here in this painting agreed that they would cease their waging conflict with the U.S. Americans here. Long story short, this angered quite a few of the other native folks, including a fellow by the name of Tecumseh, the famous Shawnee warrior. In retribution for the declaration of peace between the Wyandot, the other tribes, and the U.S. Americans here, Tecumseh and his brother, who was known as the Prophet, had Leatherlips, my 9th great-grandfather, murdered in modern-day Columbus. 5 years ago, my brother and I learned that this painting behind me, the original, is about the size of a bus. It's located at the Columbus State House here in Columbus, Ohio. Interestingly enough, there is a massive three-dimensional Mount Rushmore-like memorial to this peacemaker here, the fellow in the bottom left-hand corner of this painting. My brother and I learned all of this, and it was kind of a shock to us. We had no idea that our family history goes back to literally the very beginning of the state now known as Ohio. And not only that, but you have in the person of Chief Leatherlips of the Wyandot, over 200 years ago, was someone who was deeply personally affected by not simply matters of the United States, a young country, versus the native tribes, but interracial marriage, racism, discrimination, issues that are alive, that we're all talking about in conversations now, he had to personally deal with. And he gave his word to the US Americans that he and his people, the Wyandot, would remain at peace. Now, the personal motivation is that was for his daughter, who had married a white Frenchman who had emigrated to that time the United States, and their biracial children. And he stuck by that promise to the very end and refused to break it, to the point that he was executed by tomahawk. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? Now, here's for the end, the last thing I want to say in this story. 5 years ago, today, my brother and I, we are in Columbus, Ohio. We're visiting the memorial to him, where this exact site where Leatherlips was murdered for believing in peace between the races, between the two countries, the United States Americans and the Wyandotte Nation. My brother and I, having just learned this 5 years ago, we go up to the memorial that's there, the exact spot where he was executed, where he was frankly murdered by his own people for refusing to go back on his word to the United States, to the state of Ohio. My brother and I, we're approaching the memorial, the grave marker. You know how sometimes there are, you go up to tombstones, headstones, sometimes people will leave some like change and trinkets and dollar bills and things like that. Plastic flowers for good luck and for honoring the dead, right? My brother and I go up there, and it's not really a grave marker, it's a memorial for where he was murdered. And my brother and I, we go up to that very spot. And you know what we find on top of the memorial? We find 2 nickels, one of which is right here. The 2 nickels are the birth years of my brother and I, 1989 and 1991. There were no other coins on the memorial. If you have ever experienced synchronicity, you know what that feeling is like. For my brother and I, that moment was, you're a wizard, Harry. That was, Luke, I am your father. That was, I'm pushing into the wardrobe past it, and I feel the pines, and I feel the cold of the snow. That moment that you have, you hear about when we're kids and we read these fantasy stories, and then we actually have it. To actually have something like that, not to say that having an ancestor such as this, who's not super well known, but still has one heck of a story, was that moment for me. And I wanted to share that with you this evening, simply because nowadays, if you go to social media, you're on Twitter right now, obviously you are. Everyone's talking about race and racism and this and that and the other. These are issues that are coming up. We're having a national conversation on race, is what people are saying, right? And a lot of people are saying things such as, should we really be proud of our ancestors? Should we really take pride in what they did? Is that depending on what your background is, what your race is, should you really be taking pride? Or maybe you should take more pride in your ancestors. You should take less pride. Well, here is the question I'm going to ask you after my brother and I learned that we're the 9th great-grandsons of the man who quite literally was behind the formation of the state of Ohio. My brother and I, from that day forward, 5 years ago today, have asked ourselves, are our ancestors proud of us? Are we making proud the man, Leatherlips, chief of the Wyandotte Nation, who was willing to be executed by tomahawk, if that meant keeping his word? Are my brother and I, are we honoring that in our everyday lives, in business, in our personal lives, in our families? And I want to tell this story to you to think about who your ancestors are. They may not be part of the country's history, your country's history, You may not even know who they are. You may never find your Narnia, your treasure trove of family genealogical records in the dusted attic after a close family member passes away. But are you making your ancestors proud? The people who sacrificed generation after generation so that one day you could exist. Are you making them proud? That is a question I'm leaving you with tonight. You take care. This has been Joshua Lisec in the first ever public telling by me of the story of my ninth great-grandfather, Chief Leatherlips of the Wyandot Nation, the man who was willing to be brutally executed by his own people so that he would not have to go against his word and harm the relationship he had with his daughter and his grandchildren. Take care.